This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 25, U.S. Census Research Part 1. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Welcome to Research Like a Pro. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Diana.
And we're happy to be here today to talk about census records. We are going to be focusing on United States federal census records for this episode and the next episode. Before we dive in, we have a review from Judy. She says, "A helpful series. I need to be more methodical in my genealogy research, and these podcasts are giving me a good outline of how to proceed. Solid information presented in an easy style with generous show notes. All good." Thank you, Judy. We're excited today to offer another cheat sheet to go along with this episode, all about census records in the United States. So if you want to go to the show notes and click the link, you can download our cheat sheet all about census records, and we will include templates for extracting information from the early census records. So if you're writing a report and you want to include some information from a 1790 census record, then you can use that template to extract which tally marks go in which age group and put that into a report. All right, let's get started. What should we talk about first, Diana?
Well, I think we can do a review of just what exactly are United States Census records, because a lot of our listeners may feel like they know a lot about the census, but there may be a few fun facts that we have that we're going to share. And if anyone is kind of new to genealogy research, maybe we'll just giving you an overview of what census records are all about will help you understand them better. And like we talk about a lot in this podcast, understanding the records, why they were created, and how to use them makes all the difference in our genealogy research. So the United States Census began in 1790, and if you remember your United States history, the United States was a very young country, had just barely been formed following the Revolutionary War, and the government decided it needed to have an accurate count of how many citizens it had. So in 1790, they did a count, and the reason they needed to know was because they had this new form of government where they needed to know how many representatives a state would be allowed in the House of Representatives. And of course, it all comes down to taxes, how much tax was owed by each state to the federal government. So it was important for them to figure out how many citizens it actually had. And then following 1790, every 10 years, they would have another census, and that continues to this day. Our next United States Census will be in 2020. So the reason as genealogists we love censuses so much is that it gives us a little snapshot in time every 10 years of a family. As the government wanted to know more information about its citizens, it would add questions. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those different things that are added to census records through the years. And it's really fun to think of what the government wanted to know and maybe why they wanted to know that for a certain year. Asking yourself those questions can give you a little bit of hint about what was going on in the country at the time of the census. Now, the census workers had from 1 month to 12 months to complete the census. And it depended on the census year, what their leeway was. But sometimes you're going to get duplicate listings because a family could have been enumerated early in the year, and then the census taker in their new area came along later in the year and they were enumerated twice. And that actually happened to me with some of my research. I discovered my great-great-grandparents, Robert and Isabel Royston, enumerated twice. And I love this example because it was really obvious that somebody different gave the information. In one of them, Isabel is written out as Isabel, and in the other one, it's just Bell. And Robert is just Robert in one, and in the other, he's Robert C. So we have a more formal listing of the family versus kind of a casual listing of the family. Interestingly enough, in this family, Isabel has a daughter from her first marriage, and in one census, she's called a daughter, And in the other census, she is listed as no relationship. That kind of told me that in one census, Robert's giving the information, and his first daughter of his wife is no relationship. In the other census, it was probably Isabel giving the information, and she lists her as a daughter. Comparing the two different listings is really interesting, and it helps us understand that the information in the census really all depends upon the person giving the information. So one other thing to think about, we often think that on that census list that these people are all living right next door to each other. Well, in the rural areas, the census enumerator would often deviate from a straight course. They maybe had to go try to find a family who'd been missing the day before, and then they had to come back to where they had been. So just take that with a grain of salt when you see the order of families and realize that it may not be the exact order of the families going right down the street if it's in a rural area.
That is so interesting. And it makes sense. I wish I could follow a census taker around, if I could travel back in time to just see what it was like and how they did it and what the conversation was like when he knocked on the door.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the last census to be taken was in 2010, but we can't access the records from the previous censuses that are locked due to privacy issues. But the most recent one that we can access is the 1940 census. After 72 years, that's when the census is released and it can be viewed by the general public. Other than that, we can see all the census years before 1940 except 1890. The 1890 census, unfortunately, was mostly destroyed in a fire. I actually read that the fire didn't burn up all of the census books, but it was the water that was used to put out the fire that caused the damage to the books. So that was interesting. After that census was destroyed, we have to kind of think of different census substitutes.
Right. And 1890 is the huge hole in everybody's research. It really makes you appreciate the little snapshot in time every 10 years when you don't have that from 1880 to 1900. So many people were born within those years and maybe never listed with their birth parents. For instance, my Dora Algie Royston was born 1882, so she's not on the 1880 census. By the 1900 census, she is married, and so she never appears in the census with her parents and brothers and sisters. So that is something to keep in mind if you're researching that in-between stage. We really do have to seek out other records. And luckily, they're getting into the 20th century where there will be death certificates naming parents, maybe newspaper records, and there are other records available. So let's talk about where you can access U.S. Census records. We are living in the digital age, and we are so fortunate because back in the day, you had to go use the Soundex system and look on microfilm, and it would take you literally hours to find your families. And now, with all the index censuses, we can find them just in a matter of seconds. So the United States Census records are available on multiple platforms. They're on Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. And I always like to give everyone the tip that if you are having trouble finding your ancestor on one website, try another one because the search engines are different and they're indexed by different individuals, because we all know someone looking at our family's name may give them a strange index name. Maybe another individual read it more correctly, and so your person will pop up. So it's really important to not give up. If you can't find your person at first on the census, try the other websites. Also, back in the day when we just had the Soundex, there were individuals in counties that would make complete lists indexing their county or their state or what have you, and putting those into a book. So sometimes you can just access an entire listing of the census for a certain little area. And if they are familiar with the people in that area, they may have indexed the names more correctly. Not always, but sometimes if you're working with a bunch of records in one county, you really get to know the surnames. And so it's easier for you to recognize them. So if an indexer working just in a county with the census maybe would more accurately index the names.
That's a good idea to check the book. And even on US GenWeb, sometimes they will have the transcription of a certain census year for that county.
Good point. I'd forgotten about US GenWeb. Sometimes we get stuck in a rut and think, oh, we should only look at the census on Ancestry or on Family Search or wherever you like to look at it, especially if you're not finding your people. Broaden your ideas for searching. Now, when we are searching, we talked about this a lot in the last episode, that we always want to look at the image, not just the indexed version of it, and see if we really agree with the indexer's listing of the family's names, especially if the handwriting was hard. Some of those names may be written really interestingly. And you can often decipher the name more accurately because you know your family and you know what those names are.
Yes, and I love the ancestry feature that allows you to edit the transcription or provide another suggestion for what the name could be so that other people can find the name better.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I have seen sometimes those aren't accurate either. So take those with a grain of salt. That's just somebody's idea about what that name should be.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what you can find on each US Census. Each one is a little different, but some of the things you could find that are of genealogical value include different name variations. Sometimes they will go by their first name in one census year and their full name the next year, and then maybe their middle name 10 years later. So you can find all kinds of different name variations. You can also find their estimated birth year and birthplace. And some censuses give the birthplace of the parents, like the 1880 census. You can find more about additional marriages that they had. If they were married to someone in 1860 and then their wife's name changed in 1870, then it's possible that that man got remarried if his wife died. You can also find evidence of additional children. Every 10 years, you can see what children were born, new children added to the family, when children left the family, when they got married, or when they died. You can also find evidence of extended family members if a mother in law or mother or father is living in the household with the family. You can find out about occupations, military service, real estate, which is land, and personal estate, which is cash and other belongings. And even education and immigration information can be found on census records. So there are a lot of things to find out and a lot of things that aren't always on the transcription or the indexed record. So always look at the original.
I love looking at all of those extra categories. So many amazing things that we can find in those. And often, people in our study group, we encourage them to go back and really analyze their records. So often, when you really analyze your census records, you realize that you have missed some very important facts that are in those other additional columns. So let's talk about those early censuses, 1790 to 1840. These are the ones that have the tick marks for everyone in the household except for the head of household. And a lot of researchers don't really like to use these because they seem like they're sort of useless because they don't name everyone. But anytime that you're working in those years, they are invaluable. They are still incredibly useful. And for my client work, I use those all the time. That is generally what I'm using to analyze and try to put together families, those pre-1850 censuses. So here's just a fun little fact. It wasn't until the 1830 census that the government supplied printed forms. Before that, the enumerators had to write on whatever paper they had. If you could see the originals, you would have a wide variety of papers that they used. And it's a really, really fun book written by Katherine Hinckley. And we'll put that in the show notes and reference that later. But in her book, she includes a census page, an image of it, and it's written on floral wallpaper. So fun to just think of these census takers going out with whatever paper they could find and making their records. So from 1790 to 1840, the head of household was named. Everybody else got a tick mark, and from year to year, they changed the age groupings a little bit. So you have to carefully look at those age groupings and make sure that you're paying attention to how old people could be. But you will get the name of the head of the household, and you will find the free white males separated out in various age groups, the free white females in various age groups, and then if they had enslaved individuals, you'll find all of those listed just by their gender and age, and that begins in 1820. You'll also find in 1820, 1830, the number of foreigners not naturalized. So if that column is marked in your ancestors' census, it will give you a clue that you need to go look for naturalization records because they were still an alien and had not been naturalized.
You know, I had an ancestor with that marked and I couldn't figure out if it was really true or not. I checked the naturalization records and he wasn't in there. And part of me wonders if it was in error that that was checked, or maybe they were second generation immigrants and people still thought of them as the Scottish or Irish people. I think they might have been English or Scottish. I don't know. It's the William Keaton family. William Keaton was marked as a non-naturalized person. Anyway, I thought that clue was very interesting, but I didn't know how accurate it was because from what I had learned, he was born in the United States.
Interesting. And I think sometimes those tick marks just got put in the wrong columns, honestly. We make so many mistakes as we're typing or as we're writing things, and I can certainly see how mistakes could be made occasionally. I'm sure that they were pretty good, but you never
Now
know.
that you say that, I think most of the people on the page had that column marked. So I remember checking, and it seems like a lot of the people were marked as not naturalized citizens. It made me wonder if this was supposed to be a different column. On this page, it kind of got messed up. Or maybe the census taker didn't understand what the question was. Who knows?
That very well could be. Maybe he was thinking it was people of a foreign origin before a certain year. Who knows? That's really a good point. I really like that you checked all the other marks on the page, because that can be really helpful. That can be illuminating to kind of get a feel for what is the census taker doing. In fact, I would recommend going a few pages before and a few pages after if you have something that seems a little sketchy or something that you're questioning. It'll give you some clues about how he marked everybody.
Good idea.
Okay, and so the other thing that I just wanted to mention was that in 1840, there was a place to mark if an individual was a Revolutionary War veteran and was receiving a pension, or maybe 1812. So I think it just says military service pensioner. And so you can see if there's some military records to go search for an ancestor. And when you think about it, 1840, so if someone had been fighting in the Revolutionary War in the 1770s, they're going to be pretty old. So you're not going to see a whole lot of those. They would have had to be well into their 80s or 90s.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't seen any Revolutionary War pensioners in 1840, but I haven't looked that hard, so maybe I'll look harder. The 1850 to 1890 censuses have so much information. Let's talk about some of the fun facts from those. The 1850 census, as we all know, is the first time that they listed all of the members of the household and not just the head. So it's just that one census that I love because it seems like all of a sudden you have so much more detail and it's exciting. Well, the 1860 census has interesting things about it too. It was the first one to note Native Americans, but not all Native Americans, only Native Americans who paid taxes. And the people who were living on reservations and in unsettled territories were not listed. So it doesn't list all the Native Americans in the country. About the 1870 census, the aftermath of the Civil War caused that 1.2 million Southerners were not enumerated, and a bunch of them were just missed. And we have had a lot of problem finding our ancestors in that census, and now it makes sense because there were just a lot that weren't enumerated. So it's helpful to know that when you're searching, especially in the southern states in the 1870 census during Reconstruction. So the 1890 veteran schedule of the census was just supposed to be for Union Army veterans, but often you'll find a Confederate veteran got put on there by accident or was crossed out, and you can generally still make out their name. And this actually happened to one of our Dyer ancestors. I was searching for all of our Civil War ancestors last year, and I found the Dyer family had sons that were both in the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And so when the census taker came to do the veteran schedule in 1890 in Hawkins County, Tennessee, he was writing down Richard Fane Dyer, veteran of the Union Army, and what company he was in, Company K of the 61st Tennessee Mounted Infantry. And then he wrote down his brother's name, who lived a few houses over, Augustus Dyer, but then he crossed it off because Augustus fought for the Confederate Army. So I thought that was so interesting. And he even wrote another brother's name too, Lewis. I think Lewis was crossed off and Augustus was just left without any of the information filled out. He just put down the name and then it was like, oh, wait a second. I'm not going to finish this one. So that was fun to see and it was interesting. So you never know what you'll see on that 1890 veteran schedule. It's just supposed to be for those Union Army veterans, but sometimes you'll see a Confederate veteran too.
That is such a great story about the Dyer brothers. You run into that sometimes in those middle states where they fought for different sides of the war. What an amazing thing to see that on the 1890s schedule. That's so fun. So from 1900 to 1940, they continued to add more and more information about the family. And I love the 1900 census because that just is so illuminating. Well, for one thing, we haven't had a census since 1880, so you've got 20 years in between, like I mentioned, without anything. And then 1900, we find out the month they were born, and we find out if the couple had any previous marriages. And it just gives us so much information about the family and the individuals. We still do not know who gives the information. We don't know the informant until 1940. And in 1940, we finally get a little X with a circle around it marking the informant. And it was so fun. When I first learned about that, I went immediately and searched my dad's family because he was a little boy in 1940. And sure enough, there right next to his dad's name, Charles Wesley Schultz, he was the informant giving all the household information. So if you haven't noticed that before, go check your 1940 censuses and see if you can find the little mark that tells who the informant was. Now, something else you might find in 1940 is a little AB next to someone's name, and that means that it's a family member who's absent for some reason. And so maybe someone is off working somewhere else, but they're a regular member of this family and they're just absent. So many things that I wish we had throughout all the censuses would have helped us so much with figuring out all those earlier years if we had some things like that in those. But 1940 is when we have that. Now, something else that you can notice is this kind of fits with the idea of a little tip with searching censuses is to see if there is a denomination of a clergyman. So sometimes there's somebody that's named like a minister of the gospel in the occupation heading. Then maybe they'll put a little note about what religion he was. Well, if you can find the person who performed your family's marriage and find him on the census, you might be able to figure out what kind of a religion they were practicing. So that's kind of a fun tip. If they were not married by a justice of the peace, but by a minister of the gospel, go look up the minister and see if you can figure out what religion, and then you can look for church records. So there's all sorts of ways we can use these censuses to help us in our research.
Well, let's go through each census and talk about kind of what you can find on that year and then what was added or taken away from the next year of the questions. Would that be fun?
Sure.
Okay, so in 1850 and 1860, the date for that was June 1st, and the field count was due within 5 months. And the useful information that you can find on those are the name, age, and gender of each family member, and also the race, whether white, black, or mulatto, and the occupation, birthplace, and then if they were married that year. So that's an interesting question that you can look for if you think your relative was married within that last year. And then also the value of the real estate owned.
So I love to look for the real estate. 1850 and 1860, those are the years before the Civil War, and they can be really illuminating to see what your ancestor was doing, especially in the Southern research where we do a lot of ours. You can see if this was a large plantation, if it was just a small little holding. You get a real feel for your ancestor. So always look at that value of real estate, and then also let that guide you to the deeds and land records. If there's a large holding of land, your ancestor had to get that from somewhere, and that can be really useful in tracking them. So in 1870, that field count was also due within 5 months. And in this one, they add whether the father and mother are of foreign birth, which can be very helpful because that was an era of immigration. Like practically our entire country was an era of immigration, but that was a burst of immigration from Ireland. We'd seen a lot of Irish come over in the years preceding. And so this can help to track down some of those families to see if the parents were of foreign birth. And then we also have the value of the personal estate. And if it's over $100, you might want to check for probate to see if there's something there, if they had left anything to their family members, or if they died intestate, something had to be left to other family members.
So then for 1880, it changed a little bit. Although the census date was still June 1st, the field count was due within 30 days. So they had to go faster. And they added quite a few things. They added the marital status, the relationship of the person to the head of household, which is invaluable. You really just can't guess on those 1850 to 1870 that the children are actually their own children. You have to kind of wonder, could this be a niece or nephew? And just be careful with making assumptions about relationships until the 1880 census, because it doesn't tell you before then. Then the 1880 also adds the place of birth for the father and mother. So whereas before in 1870 it just asked if they were of foreign birth, this time it actually asked the census taker to write down where the parents were born. And one time I found a census that actually listed the exact county within England where the person's mother and father were born, and it was invaluable in the research project because it helps me pinpoint where to look for records going across the pond to England. So you might get lucky, but usually it just lists the state or country. And then the other thing that's added in 1880 is whether the person is blind, deaf, dumb, idiotic, insane, maimed, crippled, bedridden, or otherwise disabled.
Wow, and those are some pretty sad things to think about. And I read a whole article about the 1880 special schedule, which is if you had anyone who was in one of those categories, the census taker was to put them on a special schedule. And so if you have someone marked in the column for one of those categories, then you need to go look on the 1880 defective schedule.
It makes me sad that they use such unkind words to describe people who with differences and disabilities, but that's what they used back then.
It was the time. But you can get a lot more information on any of those people who were in the household and find out a great deal more information about them. So make sure you check for that and see if there was someone in the family who was perhaps blind or crippled or otherwise disabled. Now, like we said, 1890 is not available for us. There are a few schedules that survived outside of that 1890 veteran schedule. There are just a very few. I think there's a couple of counties in Texas and maybe a few other places scattered across the United States. So if you might be lucky and find the 1890. But generally, we are skipping to 1900. And this one, the date for the census was June 1st, 1900, and the field count due within 30 days, except communities over 10,000 population, and that was due within 2 weeks, which I think is really interesting. And probably, I'm going out on a limb here, but I think it was probably because they realized in these large cities, if you didn't get the enumeration done quickly, you might be counting people double or you're missing people. So they wanted to quickly get everybody when they were living where they were. So whether that really happened or not, I don't know. It was just the instructions. Now, I just have kind of an interesting little story here about the 1900 census. So you'll notice the date was June 1st, 1900. So the census taker was supposed to count everybody who was in the household as of June 1st, 1900. When I was doing my research on my Dora Algae and William Houston Schultz family, they had gotten married in 1898 and they had a baby in 1900. But the baby was born in July and he was not listed on the census, even though he would have been 2 weeks old on the census. I believe the date of the census was the middle of July. He'd been born about the 1st of July. He's not listed on the census. And it wasn't until I learned more about the census that I realized the instructions were right there. This baby was not in the household as of June 1st, so he could not be listed. Isn't that so interesting? I don't know why we didn't know about that from the very beginning of our research.
So on the actual census page, it says the date that the census taker visited their home, but then it also tells you the date of June 1st. So tell us about your family on June 1st.
So as of June 1st, Dora Algae had not had her baby. He wasn't born until July. So even though the census taker visited them in July and the baby was a newborn, he did not get to go on the census because he hadn't been born by June 1st.
We only care about people born before June 2nd.
I guess they just had to have a cutoff. There
Yeah.
was a reason they had a
That
date
makes
there.
sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So in 1900, like I said before, we get the number of years in the current marriage. So this can be helpful, especially if you can't find a marriage record or if you're stuck with a marriage record. If you find out they've been in the marriage for 11 years, okay, so counting back, let's go look for a marriage record in 1889. It can help you narrow down your search. You find that month and year of birth. And here is one that I love. It asks the question, mother of how many children, and then how many children are living. I have found so many instances where the mother has had maybe 10 children and she only has 5 living. And then we know that we've got to go look for those 5 children. And of course, with the 1890 census missing, that makes it kind of difficult. So we have to, sometimes we can't find them, especially if they're in a rural area and there's no cemetery records, no death certificates. It can be tricky, but it gives you a clue as to how many children are really in this family. And I always love it when everybody's still living and right in the household, because then I have that family figured out. We also have naturalization status. So we get to find out, was our ancestor an alien? Yeah, that's the term that they use, which always cracks me up. Have their papers been submitted, or are they naturalized? So the process of naturalization was they had to submit something called first papers, get that process going, and it spells it out. Where are they in this process? We also get their year of immigration, which is so helpful to go look for ship records and try to figure out if the John Smith you're tracing is the John Smith that came over in 1866, with so many people of the same names, especially if you're doing Irish research and you have so many coming in from Ireland with the same name. If you can find them in 1900 and see an exact date that they immigrated, that can be very helpful in narrowing down people of the same name. And then we have how many years they've lived in the United States, which kind of goes along with that year of immigration. So 1900, if I had to pick a favorite census, that maybe would be my favorite. What about you, Nicole?
I love that one too. I love that it tells you how long they were married and how many children they had and how many were still living. Those are really important questions. I wish they did that every census year.
Yeah, I do too.
While the 1910 census does have something new and exciting about it, it has the question whether or not the person was a Civil War veteran. So that's a good question. It also drops the month and year of the birth and the number of years that they were in the US. And the date changed for 1910. So the 1910 census date was April 15th, 1910, and the field count was due within 30 days, except for populations over 5,000. The population was due within 2 weeks. So I guess they decided that it was too hard to get those 10,000 people done within 2 weeks. So they dropped it to 5,000.
Well, yeah, and also it's really kind of funny to look at the census records. The census takers didn't get it done within 30 days. I've seen census records that are finished up in December. When you know the requirements and then you look at the actuality, it's kind of fun just to envision this poor census taker trying to get his work done. So I love the 1910 Civil War veteran listing because that's what gave me my clue for my ancestor, Robert Royston, that he really was a Civil War veteran. I had looked and looked. The family story was that he was a veteran, and I had looked and looked in the Civil War records, couldn't find him anywhere. I found all of his brothers, but he was not there anywhere, and so I just figured the family story was wrong. But when I revisited that 1910 census, there was a check mark in that column, but it had been covered up with a huge C.
I think it's the other way around. It was CA for Confederate Army, but there was a huge check mark through it because they were checking off all of the veterans, so they were counting them all.
Oh, you're exactly right. I'm envisioning it wrong. So, yes, they were counting all the Confederates because Arkansas was about to give out a pension and they wanted to know how many men were still alive from the Civil War, how much money they would have to pay out. Well, that gave me the idea that I should go check pension records for him or his widow. And when I put in their last name in, they were in Oklahoma by 1915. And there was the over 40-page pension for his widow, which was filled with amazing information. And she is saying that he was a sharpshoot. That was exactly her term. He was a sharpshoot in the Civil War. So that's the only record I could ever find about Civil War was the census and then her pension. They granted her the pension even though they couldn't find any records either. But because it was the Confederacy and the records weren't very good, they gave her the pension for the rest of her life.
Yeah, I wonder if that was a true story. I'm guessing that it was, but who knows?
Yeah, well, I think he probably was. His brothers were all serving. He was in Alabama. I'm guessing it was at the tail end that he joined up.
Maybe it's because he joined at the very end and he was so young that a record wasn't created or was lost because it was at the end.
And the Confederacy was falling apart.
Exactly.
The very, very end. He could have been in there for just like 1 month at the end when record keeping was not as good as at the beginning.
Yes. All right, let's jump to the 1920 census. This one, the date was moved to January 1st, and the field count was due within 30 days, except for communities over 2,500 population. That was due within 2 weeks. And this is the year when they did drop the questions about how many years have you been married and how many children have you had and how many are living. So those were only in the 1900 and 1910 census. And then the 1920s still asks whether or not you were a Civil War veteran. And it also adds a few new questions. What is your year of naturalization, your native language, and the native language of your father and mother? So some new and interesting questions.
Yeah. And in 1930, it was pretty much the same, except for they did change it back to April 1st for the date and gave the field count due within 30 days and didn't say anything about those communities over a certain population. So maybe by then they just thought, okay, we got to give our people 30 days instead of 2 weeks. But in this one, we do get to find out the age of the first marriage and military veteran, and they have to designate which war because we've had a few wars. Probably not going to have any civil wars.
There's like a couple Civil War veterans left in 1930. I found one.
Oh, cool. That's fun. You'll mainly have World War I, and then you'll also have the Spanish-American War, and you may have some other little wars. So that's always fun to look for that. And then in 1940, the age at first marriage is dropped, and then they drop the father's and mother's birthplaces, which I don't know why they had to do that, because you've got immigrants coming in. Oh my goodness, that's information we need. Why didn't they think of genealogists when they were doing these censuses? And then you get to find they drop the military veteran and the year of immigration and the native language. But they do add the X by the name of the person giving the informant, and they give you the location of where someone was residing 5 years before. So you're basically finding out 1935 residents as well as 1940. So even though they drop some really great things, they add some things. So I can't be too upset with 1940. Just wish it had been all the way complete.
All right. Well, we are running out of time, so we better wrap up this episode and then we'll pick up more in next week's episode with part 2. But before we end, we did want to mention a couple sources that are really useful in learning more about the census. So the first one that I wanted to mention is you can find the instructions that were given to the census taker for each census year. If you're not sure what something means or what the initials mean in a certain column, then you can just check those census instructions. And those are available at the National Archives website and other places online. So we will link to that in the cheat sheet and in the show notes. So make sure you download our cheat sheet about census records. And then there are 2 books that Diana recommends for doing census research. Do you want to tell us about those?
Yes, and I read all of Kathleen Hinckley's book, which is titled Your Guide to the Federal Census for Genealogists, Researchers, and Family Historians, when I was preparing for accreditation. So even though I thought I knew all about the censuses, I learned a lot from her book. So Kathleen Hinckley, Your Guide to the Federal Census for Genealogists, Researchers, and Family Historians. Not only does it have really useful information, it has some fun information. And one of my favorite parts of that book is reading the diary of this young woman who was hired as an enumerator. And she talks about tracking down individuals in the late 1800s, probably the 1880 census. And she was to ask them, of course, their names and ages, but what all the women wanted to know when she went to the neighboring farms or households were how old their neighbors were. So that kind of cracks me up because we kind of all want to know that, don't we? So it hasn't changed much. The other guide that I want to mention is by William Thorndale and William Dollarhide, and it's called The Map Guide to the U.S. Federal Censuses 1790 to 1920. And I love this book. It's probably the book that's getting the most wear on my shelf because it has the census for each state and each year. So, for instance, in 1880, it will show Virginia, and it will show what the county boundaries were like in 1880. And then it shows what the current boundaries are. So if your family was living in a certain county and you're looking for records in a certain county or looking at the census, when you look at what the county was like in 1880, you can see what those county boundaries look like. And my family was always moving around, and county boundary changes were happening all the time. So it really helps me to look at the maps and see what the counties were like for each specific census.
That's awesome. I love maps, and that book is really helpful. All right. Well, thanks for listening today, and we hope you learned something new about census records that can help you find your ancestors. So have a great week, and we will talk to you again next week.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.